A millionaire heard strange knocks coming from his car trunk in the empty underground parking lot. When he opened it, he found a homeless girl hiding inside, desperately whispering, "Don't make a sound, they'll hear us." He thought it was insane, but when she explained the reason, his heart stopped instantly. The afternoon sun poured a golden, dusty light over Evelyn's living room, painting long shadows across the dark wood furniture she had known since childhood. At 76, her life was a ritual of quiet gestures and comfortable silences. The chamomile tea in her favorite china teacup, the gentle tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the hall, the scent of lavender and old books that permeated the air. Everything was predictable, safe, and that was exactly how she liked it. Today, however, something was different. The mail carrier, a cheerful young man named Alex, had handed her an unusual package along with the usual bills. It wasn't a modern parcel wrapped in bubble mailer, but a small, unadorned wooden box, tied with coarse, aged twine. There was no return address, only her name and address written in an elegant, wavering script that felt strangely familiar. Like an echo from a long-forgotten dream, she placed the box on the polished coffee table next to her untouched cup of tea. Her heart, which usually beat in a calm, steady rhythm, now hammered against her ribs with an urgency that frightened her. Her fingers, age-spotted but still steady, hovered over the knot in the twine. Why was she so afraid? It was just a box, but a deep instinct, a wisdom that only the years can bring, told her that whatever lay inside had the power to shake the foundations of her carefully constructed life. She was the keeper of her family's peace, the rock upon whom everyone else leaned. It had always been this way. Since her youth, she had learned to smooth the rough edges, to swallow harsh words, to ensure that harmony prevailed, whatever the cost. It was her role, her identity, and this unknown box felt like a threat to all of it. With a sigh that carried the weight of decades, she undid the knot. The twine crumbled in her fingers, as fragile as a spider's web. The wooden lid creaked as she lifted it, releasing a pungent scent of cedar and old paper. Inside, nestled on faded velvet, was a bundle of letters, tied with a sky-blue satin ribbon, now faded to a near grey with time. The handwriting on the envelopes was the same as on the box, but firmer, younger. They were love letters. A chill ran down Evelyn's spine. She recognized the script immediately. It belonged to her mother, Helen, a woman she remembered as the personification of grace, devotion, and serenity. But the letters were not addressed to her father, Anthony, the man to whom Helen had been married for 50 years. The name on the recipient line was different, a name Evelyn had never heard in her entire life. "For my dearest, eternal love, Richard." Her world stopped. The ticking of the clock seemed to shout in the deafening silence. Her mother, the pillar of virtue and loyalty, the woman who had taught her about the sanctity of marriage and family, had a secret love, an eternal love who was not her father. It was impossible, a lie, a cruel joke. But the letters were there, solid and real in her trembling hands. The first letter in the bundle was dated April 12, 1948, a year before her parents' wedding. The paper was thin, almost translucent. With her heart in her throat and a sense of vertigo, Evelyn began to slide the first letter from its envelope. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to stop, to close the box and forget it forever, to preserve the immaculate image of her mother and the peace of her memories. But it was too late. The envelope seal had already been broken by time, and the first line of the letter, written in faded blue ink, was already visible. A promise of revelation that pulled her in like an abyss. The first line of the letter burned in her mind. "My dearest Richard, every day without you is like an endless winter." Her mother, Helen's handwriting was fluid and desperate, so different from the restrained, elegant script Evelyn knew from birthday cards and grocery lists. The words that followed were a torrent of feeling that drowned her. They spoke of secret meetings under the old oak by the river, of dreams of a life together in a small house with a garden full of roses, of a love so profound it seemed to steal the air from her lungs. Helen described Richard's laugh, the way his eyes shined in the sun, the feel of his hand holding hers, as if it were the only anchor in a stormy world. There was no malice in the words, only an overwhelming sadness, a longing that transcended paper and time, wrapping Evelyn in a shroud of incomprehension and pain. She folded the letter slowly, the fragile paper protesting in her hands. Who was this man who had awakened such passion in her mother? The woman she had always seen as an ocean of calm and devotion to her father, Anthony. Evelyn closed her eyes, trying to summon the image of her parents together. She saw them on the front porch in their rocking chairs, the silence between them not empty, but full of the complicity of 50 years. She saw her father bringing her mother the first rose from the garden each spring, a simple gesture that had always made her smile. Was it all a sham? A well-rehearsed performance for the good of the family? For her sake? The thought was a poison, tainting her most cherished memories, turning gold to ash. A lump formed in her throat. She felt betrayed, not just by her mother, but by her own history. A fragment of memory surfaced, sharp and painful. She was about 8 years old and had found her mother sitting in the garden, staring at nothing, with an expression of such deep melancholy it frightened little Evelyn. "What's wrong, Mommy? Are you sad?" she had asked. With the innocence of childhood, Helen had started, as if waking from a trance, and forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "No, sweetie, I was just remembering an old song." Now, Evelyn wondered what song that had been. Was it a melody that only she and Richard knew? Every little mystery, every distant look, every unexplained sigh from her mother now seemed like a link in a chain of secrets she had never known existed. The need to tell someone, to share this crushing weight, consumed her. She thought of calling her daughter Lucy. But what would she say? Lucy, your grandmother, our beacon of virtue, had a secret lover. No, she couldn't destroy Helen's image for her granddaughter. This burden, for now, was hers alone. Her eyes returned to the wooden box. The velvet nest seemed to mock her, holding more secrets, more truths that could hurt. With a heavy heart, she gently pushed the bundle of letters aside, feeling something more rigid underneath. There was more than just words in here. With her fingertips, she pulled the object out. It was a small, black and white photograph with deckled edges. The image revealed her mother, young and radiant. Her hair swept up in an elegant style, but she wasn't with Richard, nor with her father. At her side stood another woman, equally striking, her arm linked with Helen's. They were both smiling at the camera, but there was a shadow in their eyes, a complicity that went beyond simple friendship, and the background was unfamiliar, a wrought-iron gate with a crest Evelyn had never seen before. She turned the photo over. On the back, in her mother's same script, a single sentence was written, a sentence that made no sense at all. "Where the sacrifices begin, so that Clara will never forget Clara." The name echoed in Evelyn's mind, a silent bell tolling in an abandoned church. She didn't know any Clara, not in her family, not in her parents' circle of friends. The woman in the photo was a complete stranger, and yet she seemed bound to her mother by a link of complicity and secrecy. Did where the sacrifices begin? What sacrifices? Why would her mother keep a photo of a stranger with such an enigmatic message? The revelation of the secret love for Richard was already an earthquake, but this photograph, with its promise of an even deeper mystery, was the aftershock that threatened to bring down what little of her certainty remained. With trembling hands, Evelyn placed the photo and the letters back into the wooden box. The object, once a curiosity, now seemed to have a physical weight, a gravity that pulled all the air from the room. She couldn't leave it there in plain sight. It was a poison that needed to be contained. She stood up, her knees cracking in protest, and carried the box to her bedroom. She opened the walnut armoire, which creaked like an old friend, and reached for an old hat box on the highest shelf. There, among tulle veils and satin ribbons from an era that no longer existed, she hid the wooden box. She closed the closet door, but the gesture brought no relief. The secret was no longer in the box. It was inside her, pulsing like a second heart. The peace of her home, once a safe harbor, now felt fragile, a thin sheet of ice over dark, turbulent waters. Sitting on the edge of her bed, Evelyn realized that silence was no longer her ally. It was an accomplice to the secret, an empty space where unanswered questions screamed the loudest. She needed a voice, a clue, someone who could illuminate the past. And then a name came to her, Beatrice, her great aunt, her mother's older sister. At 92, Beatrice was a living relic, the keeper of the family's stories, a treasure chest of memories whose lock was a bit rusted with age, but still functional. If anyone knew who Clara or Richard V was, it would be her. Evelyn's heart quickened. The idea of asking these questions terrified her. It felt like prodding an old wound that everyone had agreed to ignore. But the alternative, living in this darkness, was unbearable. She walked to the phone in the living room, the same black rotary phone she'd used for 50 years, and dialed the number for the assisted living facility where Beatrice lived. Her hand was sweating. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. "Hello?" Beatrice's voice came through the line, as fragile as a dry leaf, but unmistakable. "Aunt B, it's Evelyn." "Evelyn, my dear, what a lovely surprise. Is something wrong?" Evelyn took a deep breath, trying to keep her voice calm, casual. "No, Auntie, everything's fine. I just called to see how you are. And, I was sorting through some of Mom's old photos, and I found one I didn't recognize." She paused, her heart pounding. "She's with a friend, I think. The name on the back is Clara. Do you remember any of Mom's friends by that name?" The line went dead silent. For a moment, Evelyn thought the call had dropped. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by a wheezing breath on the other end. When Beatrice finally spoke, her voice had lost all its lightness. It was a grave whisper, laden with a warning. "Evelyn, my dear, why are you asking about that name?" The question wasn't curious. It was an accusation. "That's a name I haven't heard in a very, very long time, and for good reason. Some doors are best left shut for everyone's sake." For everyone's sake. Aunt Beatrice's words hung in the air like smoke, suffocating Evelyn. It wasn't the answer she had hoped for, but rather an extra padlock thrown on a door she had barely begun to unlock. Her great-aunt's tone was not one of forgetfulness, but of deliberate silence, a conscious choice to bury the past. "Auntie, I don't understand. It was just a photo. Who was she?" Evelyn insisted, her voice a little louder than she intended, her anguish leaking through the words. On the other end of the line, she heard a tired sigh, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of decades of secrecy. "Helen was your mother, Evelyn. Remember her as the good, strong woman she was. The rest is dust. It's best to let sleeping dogs lie." And with that final metaphor, the conversation was shut down. Beatrice changed the subject, asking about the grandchildren, about the garden, and Evelyn, feeling defeated, went along with it, abandoning, for now, her quest for answers. She hung up the phone with an even greater sense of frustration. Beatrice's reaction confirmed her worst suspicions. Clara wasn't just a forgotten friend. She was part of a secret, a family taboo. And if Clara was a taboo, what did that make Richard? Evelyn hadn't dared to speak his name over the phone. The next day dawned grey and rainy, mirroring Evelyn's state of mind. She moved through the house like an automaton, performing her daily tasks, but her mind was far away, trapped in the shadows of the past. As she watered the ferns on the porch, her eyes fell on the old wooden bench under the jasmine trellis. It was where her father, Anthony, had spent hours reading the newspaper. She remembered him as a man of few words, but of firm, gentle gestures, a man whose presence was a silent constant in her life. He had loved Helen, of that Evelyn had never doubted. But had he known her secret? Had he known about Richard? The thought was torturous. She imagined her father, silently aware of his wife's divided heart, living a life of tacit acceptance. Was that love or resignation? Was his sacrifice as great as hers? The rain grew heavier, drumming against the window panes in a melancholy rhythm. Evelyn went inside, deciding she needed air, needed to get out of this house that suddenly felt too small for her questions. She put on a raincoat and decided to go to the public library, a place that had always brought her comfort and distraction. As she walked down the hall, her eyes were drawn to a photograph on the wall, one of many that told her family's history. It was a photo of her parents' wedding. Helen, beautiful in her white dress, smiled at the camera. Beside her, Anthony stood, serious and proud. But now, with the knowledge of the secret, Evelyn saw something else. She saw a shadow in her mother's eyes, the same shadow from the photo with Clara, a flicker of melancholy that the smile couldn't quite hide. And in her father, she saw not pride, but a kind of resolute determination, like a man shouldering a heavy burden with his head held high. At the library, the smell of paper and silence calmed her a little. She wandered aimlessly between the shelves, letting her fingers trail along the spines of books. Without knowing why, she ended up in the local history section. Her eyes scanned the titles until one of them made her stop. It was a thick, hardcover book titled The Founding Families of Hawthorne Creek. On a sudden whim, she took it down. She flipped through the yellowed pages, filled with black and white photos of men and women with somber faces. And then she stopped. Her heart gave a painful lurch. On a page dedicated to the Montgomery family, one of the oldest and most influential in town, there was a portrait. It was a young man with noble features, dark, intense eyes, and a restrained smile that seemed to hide a great passion. The caption below the photo was short but devastating. Richard Montgomery, 1928, 1948. The date pierced the fog of confusion in Evelyn's mind with the brutal clarity of a lightning strike. 1948, the same year as her mother's first letter. Richard Montgomery hadn't just disappeared from Helen's life. He had disappeared from life. Period. The image of the smiling young man in the book now seemed like a haunting, a ghost frozen in time. Forever young, forever her mother's dearest, eternal love. A shiver ran through Evelyn's body, a cold that had nothing to do with the rain outside. Richard wasn't just a lost love, he was a tragedy. And that tragedy, somehow, was woven into her family's history, a dark, silent thread in the tapestry of their lives. She felt a pang of guilt. Was she desecrating a young man's memory by unearthing this pain? But the need to understand was stronger, a relentless force pushing her forward. She continued to read the small entry on the Montgomery family. They were described as town benefactors, owners of vast tracts of land, with an impeccable reputation. The text mentioned Richard's parents, his older brother, but about him, only the dates of his birth and a cruel euphemism, a premature passing. There was no cause, no explanation, just a void, a silence that screamed as loudly as Helen's passionate words in her letters. Evelyn closed the book with a dull thud, the sound echoing in the silent library. The librarian, an older woman with glasses perched on the end of her nose, shot her a disapproving look. Evelyn muttered an apology and placed the book back on the shelf. But the image of Richard Montgomery was seared into her mind. Her mother's love hadn't been for a rival to her father, but for a ghost. The walk home was a blur. Rain beat against her umbrella, but she barely felt it. The puzzle pieces were scattered before her, but they were confusing, their edges torn. There was Helen, and her impossible love for Richard. There was his premature and mysterious death. There was the enigmatic woman, Clara, and the mention of a sacrifice. And there was Aunt Beatrice, keeping a door under lock and key that Evelyn now needed to break down. Determination replaced frustration. She was no longer just curious. She felt she owed this to her mother, her father, and herself. She had to understand the truth that had shaped the foundation of her existence. When she arrived home, soaked and exhausted, she found a message on the answering machine. It was Lucy, her daughter. "Mom, hi, it's me. Just calling to say I'll be over tomorrow for our Sunday lunch. You sounded a little off last time we spoke. Is everything really okay? Call me if you need anything. Love you, bye." Evelyn's heart tightened. Her daughter, always so perceptive. How would she manage to maintain a facade of normalcy through an entire lunch? How could she look into the eyes of Lucy, who so admired her grandparents' love story, knowing what she knew now? The thought of lying, of continuing the performance, weighed on her soul. But the truth was a hurricane she wasn't sure her daughter was ready to face. That night, sleep wouldn't come. Evelyn tossed and turned, the images of Richard, Clara, and her young parents dancing in her mind. In the early hours, defeated by insomnia, she got up and went to the armoire. She took out the wooden box again. This time, her fingers didn't tremble. She opened it and removed the second letter. It was dated a few months after the first. Helen's handwriting was different, more rushed, almost smudged in places, as if tears had stained the ink. "Richard, my love," it began. "The pressure from my family is unbearable. They speak of honor, of duty, of a secure future. They speak of Anthony, a good and honorable man who will give me stability. But how can I think of stability when my entire world is in your arms? They don't understand what we have. No one understands. Clara told me to be strong, to fight for us, but I'm so afraid of losing you, afraid of disappointing everyone. I feel like I'm at a crossroads. And every path leads to a broken heart." The letter confirmed what Evelyn already suspected. Her parents' marriage hadn't been a passionate union, but an arrangement, a decision imposed by Helen's family. And Anthony, the man Evelyn had always known as her beloved father, had been the safe choice, the harbor where Helen was forced to anchor, leaving her true love adrift on a sea of uncertainty. The pain emanating from those words was palpable. Evelyn could feel her young mother's desperation, the anguish of a woman torn between duty and desire, between security and passion. And Clara, once again, emerged as a figure of support, the confidant who encouraged the fight for this forbidden love. Who was this woman, so close to her mother, yet completely erased from the family's official history? Sunday arrived with a timid sun trying to break through the clouds. But the melancholy persisted in Evelyn's heart. The smell of the roast in the oven, which usually brought her a sense of comfort and joy, today seemed like just another part of the scenery, a prop for the play she would have to perform. Lucy arrived at noon, bringing with her the energy and vibrancy of youth. She hugged her mother tightly, planting a loud kiss on her cheek. "Mom, that smells amazing, but you look pale. Did you sleep well?" Evelyn forced a smile. "Of course, dear, just a little tired. Comes with the age, you know." The lie came more easily than she expected, and that bothered her. During lunch, Lucy talked about work, about a new project that excited her, about plans for her vacation. Evelyn listened, nodded, asked the right questions at the right times, but her mind was elsewhere in 1948, with a young Helen writing desperate love letters. "And how's Great-Aunt Beatrice?" Lucy asked suddenly, catching Evelyn off guard. "I haven't visited her in a while. We should go together sometime." The name Beatrice was like a key, unlocking the door to the anguish Evelyn was trying to keep shut. "I spoke with her the other day. she replied, trying to keep her voice neutral. She's fine, same as always. Lucy stared at her, her intelligent eyes searching her mother's face. Mom, something's wrong. You've been distant ever since I got here. Did something happen? Is it your health? The genuine concern in her daughter's voice was a needle in her heart. She couldn't keep lying, but she also couldn't just dump the raw truth on the table along with dessert. It's nothing to do with my health, sweetie. I've just been thinking a lot about the past lately. I was sorting through some old things and I found something that shook me up a bit. Lucy put down her silverware. What did you find? Evelyn hesitated. The secret was heavy on her tongue. She looked at her daughter, at the strong, sensitive woman she had raised, and made a decision. She wouldn't tell her everything, not yet, but she needed help. She needed an ally. I found some old letters from Grandma Helen. Curiosity lit up Lucy's eyes. Love letters from Grandpa Anthony. How romantic. Evelyn shook her head slowly. No, Lucy, they weren't to Grandpa. Lucy's smile vanished, replaced by an expression of utter confusion. A silence settled over the dining room, thick and heavy with unspoken questions. Evelyn knew she had just opened a crack in the door to the past, and, from her daughter's reaction, she realized that once opened, it would be impossible to close it again. The peace of that Sunday lunch was irrevocably broken, and, looking at Lucy's shocked face, Evelyn realized she was no longer alone in her quest. The burden was now shared. The revelation landed on the table like a shattered glass, splintering the familiar atmosphere. Lucy stared at her mother, eyes wide, her mouth slightly agape, trying to process the information. What do you mean? They weren't for Grandpa, she whispered, as if afraid the walls might hear. Evelyn felt a mixture of relief and panic. Relief at finally sharing a piece of the weight, and panic at the reaction that would follow. They were to a man named Richard Montgomery, Evelyn said, her voice steady despite the storm in her chest. The letters are from before her marriage to your grandfather. Lucy leaned back in her chair, confusion giving way to disbelief. Grandma Helen, our grandma? That doesn't make any sense, Mom. Their story was perfect. Evelyn felt the same sting of disillusionment that had hit her days earlier. It was the story we were told, Lucy. But maybe it wasn't the whole story. The rest of the lunch was consumed by conversation. Evelyn told her everything. The box, the letters, the photo with the mysterious Clara, the discovery of Richard's death in the local history book. She didn't hide Aunt Beatrice's reluctance, the suspicious silence surrounding the past. With each new piece of the puzzle, Lucy grew paler and more determined. Her idealization of her grandparents was crumbling, but in its place, an intense curiosity was rising, a need to understand the real woman behind the portrait of the perfect grandmother. We have to talk to Aunt Beatrice, Lucy said, her voice filled with a resolve Evelyn didn't feel. She can't just refuse to talk. It's our history, too. Evelyn shook her head. I tried, honey. She shut the door in my face. Then we'll knock again, Lucy declared. Together. The following Tuesday, the two of them drove to the assisted living facility. Beatrice was in her room, sitting in an armchair by the window, knitting a blue wool scarf. When she saw Evelyn and Lucy enter, her placid eyes narrowed with caution. An unexpected visit, she said, without stopping the movement of her needles. Has something happened? Lucy took the lead with the directness of her generation. Auntie, we need to talk about Grandma Helen. Beatrice sighed. A long, weary sound. I've already said all there is to say, Evelyn. No, you haven't, Lucy interjected, her voice soft but firm. You owe us the truth. We found the letters, Auntie, and the photo with Clara, and we found out about Richard's death. The clicking of the knitting needles stopped abruptly. The silence in the room was absolute. Beatrice laid her work in her lap and looked at them, her wrinkled face a mask of conflicting emotions. Her eyes welled with tears. "You don't understand what you're doing," she whispered, her voice choked. "You're digging up pain that took a lifetime to heal." "Then help us understand," Evelyn pleaded gently. Beatrice looked out the window at the facility's well-tended garden, as if drawing strength from the flowers. When she turned back to them, there was a decision in her eyes. Helen and Richard were in love, more than life itself, she began, her voice low and trembling. "But the Montgomery family would have never accepted her. We were a good family, but a simple one. They were town royalty. Their love was impossible, a scandal waiting to happen." She paused, swallowing hard. And then the worst happened. Richard, he didn't have a premature passing. He was gone. "What do you mean, gone?" Lucy asked. Beatrice looked directly at Evelyn, and the words that came out of her mouth changed everything. "Richard didn't die in 1948. Evelyn, his older brother did in an accident. Richard just disappeared. No one ever heard from him again. The Montgomerys, to cover up the shame, fabricated the story of his death. And your father, Anthony, knew all of it when he married your mother." Beatrice's revelation fell upon Evelyn and Lucy with the weight of a tombstone. Richard wasn't dead. He had disappeared. And Anthony, her father, the quiet, constant man, had married Helen knowing her heart belonged to a man who could, in theory, return at any moment. His sacrifice, which Evelyn had once imagined was loving a woman with a sad past, now took on monumental proportions. He had built an entire life on the fragile foundation of another man's absence. "He knew?" Evelyn asked, her voice a thread. "Why would he do that?" Beatrice looked down at her own hands, clasped in her lap, as if reading the answer there. "Because Anthony loved your mother in a way that Richard, with all his youthful passion, perhaps never could have," she said softly. "It was a patient love, a love that asked for nothing in return but the chance to take care of her. He saw how much she was suffering, lost after Richard vanished, and he offered her a safe harbor. He promised our parents he would make her happy, that he would protect her, and, in his own way, he kept that promise." The image Evelyn had of her father transformed. The quiet, reserved man became a silent hero, a guardian of a love that was not his own. Every gesture of affection, every knowing glance she had witnessed between her parents, took on a new meaning. It wasn't a sham, but a different kind of truth, a love built on loyalty, respect, and a pact of silence. "And Clara?" Lucy asked, bringing back the other mystery. "Who was she in all of this?" Beatrice hesitated, pain creasing her face. "Clara was Richard Montgomery's younger sister," she said, and the shock of this revelation was almost as great as the last. She was the only one in the family who supported their love. She was their messenger, their accomplice. The photo you found, it was taken in front of the gates of the Montgomery estate. It was the day Clara promised Helen she would help her convince the family. Suddenly, the sentence on the back of the photo made terrible sense. "Where the sacrifices begin, so that Clara will never forget." The sacrifice wasn't just Helen's and Anthony's. Clara had sacrificed something too. "What happened to her?" Evelyn asked. After Richard left, the family blamed her. They said she filled her brother's head with foolish ideas, that she was complicit in his disgrace. They sent her away. To a boarding school in Switzerland, they said. We never heard from her again. The story was more complex and tragic than Evelyn could have ever imagined. It wasn't just about a lost love, but a web of lives interconnected by secrets, sacrifices, and loss. It was a story of families, honor, and the devastating consequences of decisions made under pressure. As they left the facility, the silence in the car was heavy. Lucy was the first to speak. "So, Grandpa Anthony lived his whole life knowing that Grandma's great love could knock on the door any day." "It seems so," Evelyn replied, her admiration for her father growing by the minute. "And Grandma Helen? Did she wait for him?" For Richard, Evelyn thought of the letters, of the melancholy she sometimes saw in her mother's eyes. "I think a part of her never stopped waiting," she admitted, her heart aching. But she chose to honor her commitment to your grandfather. She chose family. She chose us." Lucy looked at her mother, her face a mixture of sadness and respect. "That's not fair. No one should have to make a choice like that." When they got home, Evelyn felt drained, as if she had lived 70 years in a single day. But the search wasn't over. The story of Clara, the forgotten ally, haunted her. What had happened to the young woman who sacrificed everything for the love of her brother and her friend? Curiosity turned into a need, a duty. They had to find Clara. They had to know the rest of the story. Lucy, as if reading her mind, opened her laptop. If she went to a boarding school in Switzerland, maybe there's a record. If her family was so prominent, the name Montgomery has to show up somewhere. The next few days became a digital deep dive. Lucy, with the dexterity of her generation, navigated online archives, immigration records, and social media, while Evelyn sat beside her, offering fragments of memory and names of old acquaintances who might have some information. The search was like looking for a needle in a global haystack. The surname Montgomery was common, and Clara's trail, after decades of silence, seemed to have vanished completely. Frustration began to set in. Each dead end was a small defeat, heightening the sense that the past was determined to keep its secrets. During this search, Evelyn reread her mother's letters, this time with a new understanding. The words were no longer just about a lost love, but about an impossible choice. In one of the last letters, written shortly before her wedding, Helen said goodbye to Richard, even without knowing where he was. "My love, wherever you are, know that a part of me will always be yours, but I cannot live on hope. Life calls to me, duty demands it. Anthony is a good man, and I have promised myself I will be a good wife to him. Perhaps happiness is not the sweeping passion we dreamed of, but the quiet peace of a safe harbor. Goodbye, my Richard. May angels watch over you." Evelyn wept as she read. She wept for her mother's pain, for her father's nobility, and for the silent tragedy they had lived. Their love wasn't the fairy tale she had always imagined, but it was real. Forged in the furnace of sacrifice and loyalty, it was an adult love, complex and imperfect, and in its own way, all the more profound. As the search for Clara continued, Lucy had an idea. "Mom, what if we search for a married name? If she left the country, she probably got married over there." The problem was, they had no idea what that name might be. It was then that Evelyn remembered a detail, a half-heard conversation from her childhood. Her mother and Aunt Beatrice whispering in the kitchen about poor Clara, mentioning something about her becoming an artist, a painter. She painted Lucy. Aunt Beatrice once said she had immense talent. This small clue was enough to renew their energy. Lucy began searching for female artists of American origin who had lived in Switzerland starting in the 1950s. The list was long. They spent hours looking at names and biographies, comparing art styles, searching for any connection to the Montgomery family. It was at the end of a long, tiring night that Lucy let out a stifled cry. "Mom, come look at this." On the laptop screen was the website for a small art gallery in Geneva. The featured exhibition was a retrospective for an artist named Clara Dubois. The biography mentioned she was born in the United States to a prominent family and had moved to Switzerland in the late 1940s to study art. But what made Evelyn's heart stop was the artist's photograph. It was an elderly woman with white hair pulled back in an elegant bun and eyes that, despite the wrinkles around them, held the same intensity and the same shadow of melancholy as the young woman in the old photograph. There was no doubt it was her, Clara. And then they saw something even more shocking. The retrospective exhibition had a title, a title that felt like a message sent across time, directly to them. The exhibition was called The Garden of Sacrifices. The air left Evelyn's lungs. Lucy took her hand, their eyes both fixed on the screen. There, in the biography, was the final confirmation, a sentence that tied up all the loose ends at once. Clara Dubois lived a reclusive life dedicated to her art, alongside her beloved brother, Richard Montgomery, until his peaceful passing last year. The information was a shockwave, reconfiguring the entire landscape of the story. Richard hadn't just disappeared. He had lived an entire life, in secret, beside the one person who never abandoned him, his sister, Clara. He had died only a year ago, an old man in Geneva. For over 70 years, he had been there, on the other side of the ocean, while Helen built a family with Anthony, the shadow of his absence always hovering over them. Evelyn felt a wave of vertigo, a mixture of astonishment, sadness, and a strange sense of peace. The ghost finally had a face, a life, and a quiet death. It hadn't been an interrupted youthful tragedy, but a long, melancholy story of self-imposed exile. "He was alive," Lucy whispered, her voice full of awe. "He was alive this whole time." The need to contact Clara became an undeniable urgency. She was the last piece, the final keeper of the truth. Lucy, with swift, precise hands, found the contact information for the art gallery. They composed an email together, weighing every word. They couldn't just say, "We are the daughter and granddaughter of your brother's long-lost love." They had to be delicate, respectful. They explained they were amateur family historians who had found an old photograph of Helen and Clara and wished to know more about their friendship. It was a half-truth, but it was the only approach that seemed sensible. They sent the email, and the waiting began. Every phone notification made Evelyn's heart leap. The days dragged on, filled with a silent anxiety. Evelyn found herself looking at the portrait of her parents on the mantel, talking to them in her thoughts. "Did you know, Mom? Did you sense he was still in the world?" she would ask Helen's smiling image. "And you, Dad, did you live with that fear, or with the hope that he would never return?" There were no answers, only the silence of her memories. On the fourth day of waiting, the reply came. It was a short email from Clara Dubois' personal address. The message was formal, written in flawless English. "Dear Ms. Evelyn and Ms. Lucy," it began. "I received your message through the gallery. The photograph you mentioned belongs to a time long past. I am surprised and curious about your interest. If you wish, we can schedule a video call. I have few opportunities to speak with people from home." The offer was more than they could have dreamed of. The possibility of seeing and speaking with the woman who, until recently, was just a name on a photograph was almost surreal. Lucy replied immediately, thanking her and making themselves available. They scheduled the call for the following Saturday at 10 in the morning, Eastern Time. In the days leading up to the call, Evelyn's house was filled with an almost electric sense of expectation. Lucy brought her laptop over. They tested the connection, the camera, the microphone, as if preparing for a royal audience. Evelyn didn't know what to feel. She was about to confront her mother's past, to speak with the woman who held the key to the entire secret. She felt a reverent fear. What would Clara say? Would she be bitter, resentful, or would she bring the peace Evelyn so desperately sought? On Saturday morning, they sat side by side in front of the computer screen. Evelyn's chamomile tea trembled in her hands, her heart pounded. Punctually at 10, the screen flickered and the face of Clara Dubois appeared. She looked exactly as she had in the gallery photo. Impeccable white hair, a string of pearls, and the same deep, wise eyes that seemed to hold a lifetime of untold stories. "Good morning," she said, her voice a little raspy but clear. "I am Clara." The face on the screen was that of a woman forged by time and sorrow, but there was an unshakable dignity in her bearing. Clara's eyes scanned Evelyn's and Lucy's faces, a silent analysis that lasted an eternity. "You," Clara said, focusing on Evelyn, "you have her eyes, Helen's eyes." The statement, so simple and direct, broke the ice and, at the same time, opened the floodgates of emotion. Evelyn felt tears welling up, a lump forming in her throat. "Yes," she managed to say, "I'm her daughter." Clara nodded slowly, a look of profound melancholy softening her features. "I thought so. Time is a curious artist, isn't it? It paints wrinkles on our faces, but leaves the essence untouched in our children's eyes." The conversation that followed was not an interrogation, but an unburdening, a mutual confession of feelings held for decades. Clara, with a calm that only distance and time can provide, told them the missing story. "When Richard disappeared, our family panicked," she began, her voice steady but laden with an old sadness. "My father was a man obsessed with honor, with reputation. A son who abandons everything for an inappropriate love was a stain he could not abide. It was easier for him to invent a death than to admit the truth." She told them how Richard, feeling the unbearable pressure and fearing his presence would only bring Helen more suffering, decided to leave. He left a note for Clara, explaining his plan to start over somewhere else, far from everything. "He asked me to look after her," Clara said, her eyes glistening, "to make sure she would be all right." But the Montgomery family turned on Clara. Seeing her as the instigator of her brother's rebellion, they exiled her. "They sent me to Switzerland, but what they didn't know was that I already had a plan," she continued, a glint of defiance in her eyes. "I used money my grandmother left me and, with the help of friends, I found Richard in Geneva. He was lost, working odd jobs, his heart broken. We decided to stay together. We were all each other had." They built a new life under new names. Clara became a painter, channeling all her pain and longing into her art. Richard found work as a restorer of old books, a quiet, solitary craft that suited his melancholic nature. "He never loved another woman," Clara said, her voice thick with emotion. "Helen was the one, the great love of his life. He kept a single photograph of her, one I took on a picnic by the river. He looked at it every night before he went to sleep." Evelyn's heart broke. Richard's loyalty ran as deep as her parents'. They were three people, trapped in a triangle of love, honor, and sacrifice, each living out their own sentence of solitude. "And my mother?" Evelyn asked. "Did she ever know he was alive?" "No," Clara answered firmly. "Richard made me promise. He saw the announcement of her marriage to Anthony in the newspapers a friend sent him from the States. He said the news set him free. Knowing she was safe, cared for by a good man, was the only peace he could have. To reveal he was alive would only destroy the life she was building. His greatest act of love was to remain a ghost." Lucy, who had been listening in silence, wiping away tears, finally spoke. "The exhibition. The Garden of Sacrifices. It's about them, isn't it?" Clara smiled, a sad, tender smile. "Every canvas in that gallery is a piece of our story, the colors, the shadows. They are the words we could never speak. It is my testament to their love and to my brother." The conversation stretched for more than 2 hours. Clara seemed starved for this connection to her past, to finally be able to speak about the brother she had loved and protected her entire life. Before they signed off, she made a request. "I have a box," she said, "with Richard's things, letters he wrote to Helen but never sent, and the photograph he kept. I would like to send it to you. It belongs to you now. It is the final thread that connects all of our stories." The promise of Richard's box hung over Evelyn and Lucy for the next week. It was the final piece, the echo of the voice of the man who had been the epicenter of that silent storm. The waiting was different now. It was no longer the anxiety of uncertainty, but the solemn expectation of closing a circle that had been opened over 70 years ago. Evelyn felt a calm she hadn't experienced since she'd first found the letters. The truth, however painful, was liberating. She no longer looked at her parents' photos with the sting of betrayal, but with a deep understanding and immense respect. She saw them as two survivors, two architects who had built a beautiful edifice on unsteady ground, and she loved them even more for it. The package arrived on a sunny Thursday morning. It was larger than her mother's small wooden box, a dark leather trunk with metal clasps. It looked ancient, an object that had traveled far. Evelyn and Lucy placed it on the dining room table, the same spot where the journey had begun. For a moment, neither of them dared to touch it. Inside weren't just objects, but a man's unlived life, his unrealized dreams, his unspoken words. With a nod from Evelyn, Lucy unfastened the clasps. The scent was the same as from Helen's box, cedar and old paper, the perfume of time. On top lay the photograph. It was small, yellowed, its edges worn from being handled so much. A young Helen was laughing at the camera, her hair blowing in the wind, pure, radiant happiness on her face. Evelyn had never seen her smile that way in any other picture. It was the smile of a woman completely in love. Below the photo were bundles of letters, far more numerous than her mother's. They were organized by year, tied with different colored ribbons. They were the replies Helen had never received. Richard had written to her for years, perhaps his whole life. Evelyn picked up the first bundle, dated 1949, a year after his disappearance. She opened the first letter. Richard's handwriting was strong and clear. "My Helen," it began. "Today I received the news of your marriage. A friend sent me the newspaper clipping. I must confess my first impulse was despair. But then I looked at your picture and I saw the serenity in your face, and I understood. Your happiness is my freedom. Anthony is a lucky man, and I know he will make you happy. I pray that he does. As for me, do not worry. I will find my way, but know that in every sunset, in every sad song, in every book of poetry, it is your face I will see. Forever yours, Richard." Evelyn's tears fell on the paper, mingling with the faded ink. They were letters of a painful beauty. He wrote about his life in Geneva, about his work, about his walks with Clara. He described how he missed the smell of the damp earth back home, the taste of the fruit, the warmth of the sun. And in every letter there was a declaration of eternal love, an acceptance of his fate, and a genuine wish for her happiness. He was never bitter. He never blamed her. He just loved her, from a distance, with a silent, unshakable devotion. Lucy, reading another letter over her mother's shoulder, was sobbing quietly. "He loved her so much," she whispered. Evelyn continued to read, moving through the years. The letters became less frequent over time. They spoke of her birth, Evelyn's. Richard had written, "I heard you had a daughter, Helen. I imagine she has your eyes. Give her all the love the world can contain. Tell her that life is a precious gift." It was as if he were there, watching from afar, a silent guardian angel. At the bottom of the trunk was one last envelope, thicker than the others, undated. Evelyn opened it. Inside, there wasn't a letter, but a sheaf of charcoal drawings. They were portraits, dozens of them, and they were all of Helen. Some based on the single photo he had. Others seemed to come from memory, capturing different expressions, different moods. It was a life study of one beloved face. And then, among the drawings, Evelyn found one that made her hold her breath. It wasn't Helen. It was a portrait of an older woman with the same eyes as her mother, a gentle smile, and her hair in a bun. It was her, Evelyn. Richard, somehow, had imagined her. Or perhaps Clara had described her to him. It was a face that blended the longing for the past with hope for the future. Tucked with the drawing was a small note, "For Helen's daughter. May you know a love as great, but may you never have to make the same choice." That last drawing, that final note, was the key that finally opened Evelyn's heart to complete acceptance. There was no more room for resentment or confusion, only a deep, overwhelming sense of compassion for everyone involved. Richard wasn't a ghost haunting her family, but a silent pillar of a love that, in its renunciation, allowed her life to exist. His sacrifice and that of her parents were not tragedies that diminished their lives, but complex acts of love that defined them. In that moment, sitting among the memories of two extraordinary loves, Evelyn knew what she had to do. The story couldn't end here, stored away in boxes. It needed to be honored, shared, and above all, forgiven. The following week, she and Lucy packed their bags. They bought 2 tickets to Geneva. Evelyn had never been much of a traveler, but this journey felt like the most essential one of her life. She needed to meet Clara in person. She needed to close the circle, not just for her parents or for Richard, but for herself. The flight was quiet, a long pause for reflection above the clouds. When they landed in Geneva, a new world opened up for Evelyn. The city was beautiful, orderly, but the cool European air seemed to carry the melancholy of the story that had brought her there. Clara was waiting for them at arrivals. In person, she was even more striking, small and frail, but with a strength that emanated from her clear eyes. The hug they shared was that of old friends, of survivors of the same long, emotional war. They didn't need many words. Clara took them to her apartment, a large, light-filled space that also served as her studio. The walls were covered with her paintings, Swiss landscapes mixed with explosions of tropical color, a homesickness transformed into art. And at the center of it all, on a place of honor, was an unfinished portrait of Richard, an old man with young, passionate eyes. "I talk to him every day," Clara said simply. Evelyn handed her the small wooden box with Helen's letters. Clara held it with an almost religious reverence. Her words, "Finally," she whispered, tears streaming down her wrinkled face. He waited his whole life for them. That afternoon, sitting in Clara's living room as the weak Geneva sun streamed through the window, they brought the 2 boxes together, Helen's and Richard's. They read passages from the letters aloud to one another, Helen's voice, young and desperate, Richard's voice, resigned and eternally devoted. It was as if the 2 of them were there, finally having the conversation that fate had denied them. The next day, Clara took them to the cemetery. Richard's grave was simple, a marble headstone that read only, "Richard Montgomery, a good brother." Evelyn placed a single white rose there, the same flower her father, Anthony, had given her mother every spring. It was a gesture of unity, a recognition that both men had been essential in Helen's life. "I think they would have understood each other," Evelyn said. More to herself, "I think they both loved her enough to want her happiness above their own." Before they returned to the States, Lucy had an idea. With Clara's permission, she photographed all the letters, the drawings, and the paintings from the exhibition. "This story needs to be told," she said, "not as a family scandal, but as a lesson about the different forms of love." Evelyn agreed. The secret that had once terrified her was now a legacy of sacrifice, loyalty, and the extraordinary human capacity to love against all odds. As she said goodbye to Clara at the airport, Evelyn felt she was leaving the weight of the past behind, but taking its wisdom with her. The journey that had begun with a mysterious box had ended with the discovery not of a dark secret, but of a luminous truth about the strength of the bonds that define us. The flight home was permeated by a different kind of silence than the one on the way there. It was no longer the quiet of nervous anticipation, but the serene calm of resolution. Evelyn looked out the window at the carpet of white clouds and felt as if she were floating not just in the sky, but in a new state of being. The world looked the same, but her perception of it had deepened, gained new colors and textures. When she walked into her house, the familiar scent of lavender and old books welcomed her like an embrace, but the space once a sanctuary of peace built on silence, now felt different. It was a stage, a living archive of a story much larger and richer than she had ever known. The shadows in the corners no longer hid secrets. Now they held echoes of resilience. In the days that followed, Evelyn and Lucy dedicated themselves to a new project. Lucy bought a large, leather-bound scrapbook, noble and old-fashioned in its appearance. Together, they began to create a new family testament. They didn't remove the old photos, the happy images of weddings, christenings, and birthdays. Instead, they contextualized them. Next to the wedding photo of Helen and Anthony, they placed the image of a smiling Richard and the one of Helen and Clara, linked in complicity. In careful script, Evelyn transcribed excerpts from the letters, her mother's and Richard's, as small captions. The story of an impossible love was no longer a secret to be hidden, but a prologue that made the story of their 50-year marriage even more meaningful. The scrapbook didn't tell a story of a lie, but of multiple loves, of profound sacrifices, and of unwavering loyalty. When the scrapbook was finished, Evelyn placed it on the living room coffee table, and next to it, the two boxes, Helen's and Richard's, side by side, finally together. They were no longer artifacts of a painful secret, but relics of a heritage of strength and love. Evelyn took the old framed portrait of her parents from the mantel and placed it between the two boxes, Helen and Anthony smiling, now watched over by the memories of the man who had brought them together and the love that both, in their own ways, had honored. That small arrangement became the new heart of the house, an altar to the complex and beautiful truth of her family. One evening, sitting in her armchair, the soft light of a lamp illuminating the room, Evelyn looked at her new sanctuary. The tick-tock of the grandfather clock no longer sounded like a countdown to the unknown, but like the steady, reassuring rhythm of a life that goes on, enriched by its past. She realized that the harmony she had always strived to maintain was not a fragile facade. It was a fortress, built with the bricks of her father's sacrifice, her mother's resilience, and Richard's selfless love. Her life, her very existence, was the result of the convergence of all those forces. She was not the daughter of a lie, but of one of the most moving love stories she had ever known. A serene smile touched her lips. She was finally at peace, not with an idealized version of the past, but with its imperfect and extraordinary truth. Love, she understood, has many forms, and the strongest of all may be the one that knows when to sacrifice, when to wait, and finally, when to forgive.